this time you're not getting rid of me quite so quickly because I get to moderate the next panel. And I just want to reflect for a second on the fact that we have a huge crowd. It's been so great. I always say that there's actually a lot of climate nerds and a lot of trade nerds, but there are very few climate and trade nerds. But maybe you're proving me wrong. This is a really nice crowd. Or maybe there's just a bunch of climate separately trade nerds here who are, cross-curious, trying to learn. And I just, when we started working on this 2.5, 3 years ago, I don't think we would have been able to fill a room like this. There was just like a couple dozen people, that you would want to talk to that had been thinking about this. We've really just come so far. And I thought what Brian Deese had to say was so interesting. He also mentioned critical minerals, which is a topic that we hadn't covered quite so much today. I'll note that tomorrow morning, we at BPC are working with the American Critical Mineral Association on an event that will feature Senator Hickenlooper, and it will coincide with the release of our new report on critical mineral demand-side policy. So if you're interested in critical minerals or demand-side policy, please look out for that. And now I'd like to bring to the stage Senators Sheldon Whitehouse and Bill Cassidy. Please give me Thank you.
Have a seat.
All right.
All right.
So these are no strangers to most of you. If you think at all about border carbon policies, these are probably two of the names you know. They've introduced actual, honest-to-God legislation implementing a border carbon adjustment. We're not talking about a data bill here. We're talking about actual border carbon policy. And that's amazing. We've got a senator from Rhode Island that's a Democrat, a senator from Louisiana that's a Republican, and they both have bills that use an emissions performance standard as the basis for this carbon border adjustment. There are plenty of differences between their bills, but there's really interesting and key similarities, which makes me really optimistic. And again, we're going to save a few minutes at the end of this chat for audience Q&A. So if you want to submit questions, feel free to go ahead and do that now. And if I'm not feeling too selfish, I will ask them instead of my own questions. First question, Senator Whitehouse, is to you. The EU is going through the process of implementing their new carbon border adjustment mechanism, the CBAM. It's getting a lot of attention. Some people think it's a really great, terrific policy. Some people think it's not designed well. There's a difference of opinion there. But one thing that is quite clear is that they are acting, and the US, up to now, is not doing much. So my question for you is, how should the US be responding to the EU CBAM? And what is the case for US leadership in this policy space?
Well, let me start at the very 50,000-foot level, which is that it's pretty clear right now that we have frittered away so much time dealing effectively with climate change that the remaining avenues to find a path to climate safety are extremely few, and all of them require a price on carbon pollution. You just can't have it be free to pollute and get to climate safety, period. So the CBAM, in that sense, is a terrific thing, fussing about the design aside, because it is, and because they're going to stick to their guns, and because if you don't want to be tariffed, you're going to have to step up yourself. When we did the IRA, we got a lot of complaining out of the European Union. And when they complained, I would say, tough bounce, suck it up. If you don't like it, do your own. And I think those exact words should properly come back to us in response to the EU and now UK CBAM effort. The good news is, to state the obvious, it's bipartisan. The other good news is that we are not just two senators having a conversation in hallways, but we have a very substantial and robust support network of think tanks, both liberal-leaning and libertarian-leaning, who are working together pretty seamlessly to provide at least intellectual support for us. And the last piece of good news is that even if we sit on our rear ends and do nothing and just let the CBAM hit us, that will be good for the US economy, because the discrepancy between what the tariffs are on our producers and what the tariffs are on Chinese producers are enough to offset the wage and pollution cheating benefits of running your supply chain into China. So it is expected that there will be significant job and manufacturing growth in the United States as a result of the EU CBAM, and we only accelerate that further if we kill off the headwind of tariffs on our products going to the EU and the UK. So it will be good, and again, working in bipartisan fashion to try to get towards an ultimate compromise, it will be a lot better. And that's setting aside the climate benefits of avoiding havoc and catastrophe. That's just pure economic jobs calculations. So I feel pretty good about all this.
Yeah, good jobs and avoiding havoc and catastrophe seem like two nice things.
Yeah. And it's not too bad to work bipartisan.
As a representative of the Bipartisan Policy Center, I will agree with that.
Thought that might be a point you'd like.
Senator Cassidy, the Louisiana legislature passed a resolution at the state level last year supporting a border carbon adjustment, stating that the US Congress should, and I'm going to quote from this resolution from the Louisiana state, enact a trade policy that holds high-polluting countries like China and Russia accountable for their pollution and promotes American economic development and the rebuilding of United States supply chains, particularly in rural communities, by rewarding American businesses and workers for their superior environmental performance while penalizing global polluters. That's the Louisiana state legislature. So can you help us understand, why is this policy space, why are these sorts of policies so important and good for Louisiana?
And did you write that?
I could have, but importantly, I didn't. It kind of rose spontaneously from the people there. And so I'm going to, if this is kind of Sheldon's side of it, I'm going to give my side of it, and you'll see that despite apparent differences, they are very complementary. What my state legislature acknowledges, and which Sheldon alluded to at the very end of his remarks, is that the United States has made incredible progress in decreasing our emission profile. We now have an emission in absolute amounts, not per capita, not per unit of economy, in absolute amounts, lower now than we did in 1988. 1988 is here. This is where we are. Now, this has been part of marginally renewables, marginally regulations. Principally, it has been the substitution of natural gas for coal as a feedstock for utilities and as a feedstock for chemicals and plastics instead of oil. So, we in Louisiana are very aware of this. We are very aware that natural gas has literally fueled the declining emissions associated here. When Sheldon speaks about our emission profile being lower relative to the Chinese, not surprising. They continue to use coal for their utilities. They don't turn on their scrubbers, so they don't comply with kind of norms on environmental regulations. My state legislature recognizes that if you're a chemical company in Louisiana complying with US environmental regulations, using natural gas as a feedstock, or perhaps nuclear-derived energy, because we have a couple big nuclear power plants to run the operation, then that your emission profile is much lower than the Chinese. And so if you're going to go over to Europe, and they're going to penalize the carbon intensity of your good, as Sheldon mentioned, we are at a natural advantage. Now, let's build upon that. If the United States similarly puts in such a foreign pollution fee, is how I refer to it, a foreign pollution fee, in which goods coming into the United States have the avoided cost of noncompliance with regulation layered over the cost of the product coming in, then our goods will be at a competitive advantage in the United States. And then if you extend that once more, if the United States and the EU team up with Japan, Australia, Canada, UK, you name it, in which anybody who wishes to import into one of those countries has to comply with kind of international norms on controlling emissions, then we're taking Western standards of environmental protection and exporting them in return for access to the richest markets in the world. Now, that is all layered into what my state legislature is advocating. And that's why, frankly, I think that the foreign pollution fee and trade is incredibly good for American workers, incredibly good for our economy, and I could go further saying it's incredibly good for our national security.
And I love how you bring in the international aspect of, we're talking about a US-based policy, but there's plenty of room to work in coordination with allies to increase trade between allies. We're not talking about a policy that's intended to decrease trade generally. It's about who we trade with and what the incentives are on those other countries to decarbonize if they want to import into our country.
Yeah, ideally you have a common trading platform with the EU, the UK, the US, Canada, Mexico. Australia, Japan, Mexico, and that enormous common platform sends an incredibly powerful price signal out to the rest of the world to clean up their pollution, because we can clean up US carbon pollution and methane pollution, but there's a whole world out there that needs to address its problems, and the price signal is the best way to get there. You can hector and you can encourage and you can, plead, but a good solid price signal gets a lot more attention.
And as proof of concept, in the USMCA, there are certain environmental and labor standards required of Mexico. Now, we don't typically think of Mexico as being the most kind of environmentally sensitive country. But if you look at the amount of pollution or air emissions associated with producing a ton of steel, and let's say in the US it's 1. In the EU it is 1. In China it's like 2.64 or something like that. In Mexico it's 1.2. The Mexican emission profile is almost the same as the United States, which shows that using trade as an instrument to promote the commonality of concern for emissions has worked with Mexico. And I think that kind of use case tells us it could work with others too.
So, the two of you clearly agree on so much. You've each written detailed, thoughtful pieces of legislation. And you made some different design choices. And everyone here should have received a copy of our new report from BPC that we released on Monday, laying out the different design options for designing this kind of policy, the pros and the cons of each. And if you read it, you'll see, we lay out which are the ones that are in the Foreign Pollution Fee Act from Senator Cassidy and which are the ones in the Clean Competition Act from Senator Whitehouse. One of the key differences between your two bills is that Senator Whitehouse, your bill has a strong domestic component,
yep.
And you apply that same domestic emissions performance standard to imports, whereas Senator Cassidy's bill is really an imports-only policy with no specific domestic component. So, Senator Whitehouse, how do you think about that difference between your two bills? How important do you think the domestic piece is to the overall success of the policy?
Well, I think just to start with the politics, it's a hell of a lot easier for a Democrat to advocate for a domestic price on carbon pollution than it is for a member of the Republican Party to do that. So it ain't all that tough for me. I think that what we're both doing is trying to build support for the concept of responding to the CBAM and dealing with the climate issue using the levers of trade policy and economic price signaling to cause results, good, efficient market behavior. And at the end of the day, I think our bills are likely to come together. How they come together is TBD. We haven't pre-negotiated anything. But I do believe the European Union folks when they say that they will not waive tariffs on any country's exports unless that country has a domestic price on carbon. And so at some point, American industry is going to have to look at that and make a decision about, do we want relief from tariffs, or do we want to continue the free-to-pollute business model that has caused so much damage? And I think as that begins to come together, you'll see more and more of a conversation about that, more and more economic studies about the winners and losers and so forth. But I think at the end of the day, we have a bipartisan, bicameral bill, and we're going to find different ways to get there. And it may or may not include a domestic carbon price, but I think if the EU sticks to its guns, and I think the EU will, the economic imperative ultimately becomes powerful enough to overwhelm the political cautions.
So, I like that you do think that there is a way to eventually marry these two bills together, though I note that you mentioned there is no prenuptial agreement
there's no
on how we get there.
I don't like that image. Bazan, can I address that too?
Yes, sir.
One, wherever you are, Lily Roberts, that's a question that's up here right now.
I know, her timing is perfect.
Hats off to you. I oppose it not because I'm a Republican, because I think it's terrible policy. It is an incredibly regressive tax. Now, we don't have to imagine this. If you look at the story in the New York Times about the woman in Maine who can hardly afford her heating oil, and she has to borrow from her church in order to afford to heat her home in the winter, or the people in Western Massachusetts who, because Massachusetts has the highest utility cost in the nation, have a difficult time affording their utilities. Imagine if you increase that more with a carbon tax. It is a regressive tax. It falls disproportionately upon the poorest people in our society. Now, we can say we're going to pass it through government back to them, but government has sticky fingers, and you tend to employ a lot of people who get a lot of benefits, and they end up earning six-figure incomes to work from home with no accountability as to whether they're really showing up. I'm not making that up. That is the reality today. Now, let's tell the American people, you're going to pay a lot more for your utilities in Maine, air conditioning in Louisiana, so that we can pass back through some tax break to you. Politically, this is not only just bad policy, politically it's a non-starter. But let's go to a couple other of the objections. The EU is not going to dictate our policy. If the EU says you're going to do it our way or we're not going to do it at all, frankly, we're a bigger economy than the EU. They have a vested interest in partnering with us. But let's just take on their argument that they want to have a cost of carbon. Technically, they don't have a cost of carbon. They have a cap and trade system, and in that is imputed a price on carbon. The economists would also say, though, that compliance with a regulatory regime to decrease emissions is also an imputed price of carbon. So there's three ways to tax carbon. One is to tax carbon. The second is to have a cap and trade, as the Europeans do. And the third is to have the imputed cost of compliance with the regulatory regime. We have a very expensive regulatory regime, very expensive, but we're pleased for it. It's controlling our emissions. That's what we want to make China pay for, which currently they're not paying for. That is a very real cost, and to imagine that it is not is to deny what the economists would tell us. Now, one more thing I just have to say, because you're a sophisticated audience. I spoke specifically of a point source carbon tax. Again, think of, I don't know, the carpet in the room. But there's also non-point source, which is fuel, jet fuel. We already have a carbon tax on that. It's called a gasoline tax, or a diesel tax, or a jet fuel tax. So if society wants to say for non-point source, gasoline, we're going to jack up the gasoline tax, as what California has done to try and discourage the use of. But that's going to be something which is done not as a public policy on the federal level by and large. I think that will just be kind of flowing naturally from what states do.
So you can see we're going to disagree on this.
Yeah, a little bit of a disagreement.
And I don't want to, prolong the argument indefinitely, but I do think it's important to recognize that a pollution fee that is actually paid by the polluter is a very different thing than taxing the little lady in Maine who Bill Cassidy mentioned, she might never see the result of the pollution fee because, first of all, the entity that is being penalized for polluting might pollute less, so the fee goes down. And second, as is the case right now, they might be making so much damn money that if you believe in market competition, they're going to have to absorb a good deal of that as they try to compete for the business of the nice lady from Maine. So the notion that this is a tax on the end user as opposed to a penalty on the polluter, I think is the one point that I would add to the conversation.
Thank you. All right, next time we'll have to bring in Senators Collins and King so they can,
Tell us more
respond
about the little old
to the
lady from
little old
Maine.
lady in Maine. Senator Whitehouse.
Ooh, better be careful there, brother.
A lot of people think of you as a climate champion. But it's also worth noting that you are the chair of the Senate Budget Committee. And the US is not exactly in a great fiscal situation right now.
Correct.
Deficits are high, debt is high. Next year, $4 trillion of tax cuts, including cuts to individual income taxes, are set to expire. So, in that fiscal environment, what is the case for this climate and trade policy as a potential revenue raiser?
Well, there are a couple. First of all, as I think Bill and I agree, the CBAM itself and a carbon border fee in the United States, in addition, boosts American manufacturing and American jobs and the American economy. So you are, in fact, lifting the economy, and that creates more revenue. You grow your way out of it. Now, our troubles are too big to just grow our way out of. We're going to have to deal with revenues, and if you're looking at a revenue proposition, depending on who you want to get revenues from, people who are polluting a lot look like a much more appealing place than people who are, say, working and raising income taxes. So I think there's that. And the third piece, which we've been focusing on in the Budget Committee, is that a third of our roughly $30 trillion debt comes from economic shocks that we didn't prepare adequately for. One was the 2008 mortgage meltdown, and the other was the COVID pandemic. That's $10 trillion plus that they just blew up and added to our debt. So we need to remember that that happened and look ahead to what the coming economic shocks are. And I would argue that there is enormous, very well validated warning of an imminent economic shock coming from climate catastrophes. And I think, I hate to say this, but I think we're actually in the early stages of that in Florida right now, as the property insurance market in Florida melts down. And as the chief economist of Freddie Mac said, the way this operates is you first have your insurance get too expensive to afford, and then you can't get insurance at all. The companies have withdrawn. And then you can't get a mortgage, which means that you can't sell your house because you're only dealing with buyers who can pay cash, and that crashes the supply and demand. So you go from an insurance crisis to a mortgage crisis to a property values crash. And avoiding that by being more responsible about addressing climate havoc, I think is time well spent for Congress.
Senator Cassidy, you released your Foreign Pollution Fee Act last year.
Say that one more time.
You released your legislation, the Foreign Pollution Fee Act, last year. And kind of a lot has happened since then. The White House announced a new climate and trade task force. We heard from Ben Beachy earlier about that. We've seen the Prove It Act advance through the EPW committee on a strong bipartisan vote. Now it's introduced in the House, also bipartisan. How has the moving, the momentum on this issue, along with, I think, renewed and increased stakeholder engagement, shaped your strategic thinking about how to move forward in this policy space?
So, very good question. And you've mentioned all the positive things. Let me give you my elevator pitch as I would speak to a colleague, and then I'll build from there as to how I think it goes from there. In our country, you cannot separate energy policy from climate policy, from economic development policy, from national security. While we've been paying to decrease our emissions, China has been ignoring norms for emissions control, lowering their cost of manufacturing, attracting jobs from around the world to China, strengthening their economy, and they've used that economic growth to fuel military activism. So our energy policy, our climate policy, our economic policy has all played into national security. If you put in a foreign pollution fee or carbon border adjustment mechanism, then China has to comply, or else they pay a fee. But either way, it's somewhat of a drag upon their economy. It equalizes the playing field as to where economic growth occurs, and I'd like to think that more of it would occur here relative to there. That drag on their economy will then kind of put the brakes on their ability to pay for militarization. And of course, energy policy feeds into this. Now, if I'm speaking to a hawk, I'm saying this is a policy by which we can help defeat Chinese militarism, at least take a little bit of the air out of it. If I'm speaking to a climate hawk, I can say, well, Sheldon always knows this, but this is a way to get the world's largest emitter to begin to decrease their emissions. If I'm speaking to my Louisiana legislature, I said you can't help but notice that if the Chinese used our natural gas instead of their coal, they could better comply with lowering their emission standard. And that would be economic growth in the United States because so many people are involved in our energy industry. Now you put it all together, you've got a message for whomever you're speaking to. Robert Lighthizer, now speaking of, whatever you think about this, President Trump looks like he's going to be our next president if you believe the polling. Robert Lighthizer has been very influential in his trade thinking. In his book, No Trade is Free, he recently wrote in favor of a carbon border adjustment mechanism for everything I just described. But you mentioned that the White House just had their carbon border kind of trade issue. So I think that there is a bipartisan recognition that China ignoring international norms on pollution control have allowed them to have the economic growth that has enabled their militarization. So I put all that together. There's going to be headwinds. There's going to be people you got to explain it to. But when the China Commission over on the House side is understanding this issue, talking about this issue, when Lighthizer is writing about it and endorsing it, when Trump wants to put tariffs on the Chinese goods, just a kind of carte blanche, this is actually more of a rational approach. And let me say one more thing. I do not want a hot war with China. None of us should want a hot war with China. This is a way to kind of put the brakes upon their economic growth, to bring them into alignment with what we consider norms in a way which is not a hot war. One of our questions earlier suggested that this could be a form of protectionism. I point out the Chinese can get rid of this tariff just by complying. Think about that. In fact, I mentioned this to a Chinese minister from the Chinese government, and he goes, we could live with that tariff. He knows what he's dealing with as opposed to it being arbitrary. So I actually think that this is incredibly good foreign policy, incredibly good economic policy, and incredibly good climate policy.
So it feels like you're saying like this is where we can get the China hawks and the climate hawks to work together
and the economic
to push off the war hawks.
The war hawks don't want war, but certainly if China continues to militarize, you'd be naive to assume that we're not supposed to do something. This is a way which, again, just puts a little bit of a drag. And that drag, slowing them down, maybe they have to divert more resources to the welfare of their people as opposed to building another battleship.
All right, so we're going to move on to audience questions. We've had a few cycling through here. The one that caught my eye just a second ago was on least developed countries. How does a policy like you would envision affect least developed countries? Is there a way to design it in a way that we think is fair, but is also still effective?
I would say that, first of all, you can avoid deeply impoverished countries. Second, you could pair it with very significant capital investment to help Indonesia, for instance, move from coal power to geothermal. It's the ring of fire. They have geothermal all day long. So, but for many of these poorer countries, the capital constraint of moving to the new technology is an impediment. Once you actually put a price on carbon, then there's a revenue proposition to making that move, which brings investors. So it actually helps them in that sense. And then finally, if you're looking for the really clean technologies of solar and wind, you have enormous capabilities in the global South. And the prospect of developing those capabilities, once there's a rationale for doing it, once it pays to put the cables under the Med so that Europe's demand can be met out of Saharan solar fields, things like that, you end up, I think, with this being a winning proposition for the global South. But it is an issue that has to be watched carefully along the way, because you can't say, great, it's going to be a winning proposition for you in 2040, but you, Mr. Minister, need to go back and get elected now, and it's going to suck for you now, but you're just going to have to, tough bounce and wait for it to turn your way. So it's an issue that we have to watch and manage. It's a moral imperative as well, because it was our pollution that created this mess. But I do think that in its pure natural state, it is actually immensely advantageous for the global South.
Senator Cassidy, we're about to wrap this, but I want to give you a chance to answer.
I'll be brief.
Yeah.
Our bill relies, it will complement what Sheldon just said. Our bill relies upon behavioral economics. Right now, if Vietnam wants to outcompete China, they've got to lower their manufacturing costs less than China, which means that they have to even be more kind of callous regarding environmental standards than the Chinese. Remember, cost to control emissions. But wait a second. If now the country which has the cleanest product avoids the emission, the way that they outcompete the Chinese is not by lowering the standards of those of the Chinese, but by increasing the standards of those of the US, the EU, et cetera. And so we flip the current dynamic on the head of how this works. Now, secondly than that, we also in our legislation say that if you're a low middle income country, we will grandfather in your existing base, but expect anything built from henceforth to be compliant with Western standards. If you're a high middle income, which China and Russia are high middle income, we don't grandfather in products. And so we give them actually a little bit of a head start. They're not as wealthy, they don't have the same ability to adapt as the Chinese, and so we kind of compensate for that. So we think between those two kind of mechanisms, behavioral economics and grandfathering in, we create that pathway for those less well-off countries to outcompete the people with whom we wish them to outcompete.
Senators, thank you so much. This was terrific.
Thanks for having us on, Zan. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Zan.
Good to see you.